So we're nearing the end of the F1 summer break. Thank all who is holy because there's no news and us F1 YouTubers want to kill ourselves. Well, Colapinto crashed, but as I said, no news. That got me reminiscing a bit, back to a time where there was some news. Actually, quite a lot of it. The year is 2022, and Sebastian Vettel has just made his first ever post on Instagram. Never mind, he's retiring. This was massive news, and it didn't take long before the story got even bigger. Vettel's spot at Aston Martin being taken by then Alpine driver Fernando Alonso. The French marquis, then deep in discussions with the Spaniard about an extension, were a little surprised by this, which is a polite way of saying they were rather pissed off. Thankfully, Fernando showing all the commitment of my ex-girlfriend sort of saved a problem that had been brewing under the surface of that team for a couple of years. Oscar Piastri had won the Formula Renault Euro Cup in 2019. A year later, he took top spot in FIA Formula 3. A year after that, he was winning the FIA F2 crown. Those last two titles as a rookie, and that doesn't happen very often. A step up into Formula 1 then for 2022 made a lot of sense, and the Oscar was an Alpine affiliate, a driver development system that back then promoted their rookies into Formula 1 about as often as my ex-girlfriend texted me back. I'm really getting over this breakup, aren't I? Part of the reason Alonso jumped ship was because Alpine finally had a plan to change that, preparing to put the Spaniard down after one more season to finally buck the trend and allow one of its juniors to go at the pinnacle of motorsport. Now they had a seat free and could slot Piastri right in. So the announcement is made, Oscar Piastri is now a driver in Formula 1. Only he's asleep in the land of things that want to kill you and has no idea any of this is going on. Oscar proceeds to wake up, find out that he's achieved his life dream, but isn't happy about it, as he's been working behind the scenes to get out of his Alpine arrangement and join the land of the 4-year-olds for 2023 instead. We thus get the infamous tweet, the French throw their toys at the pram, yada yada yada, you've heard all this before anyway. And jump to present day, Piastri leads the standings going into the second half of 2025, while the baguettes crumble at the rear of the field, thus making this potentially one of the greatest contract plays in Formula 1 history. But what if this didn't happen? Granted, as someone who would probably struggle to predict what day of the week comes next, this usually wouldn't be my forte. However, this time we have the benefit of hindsight, thus one never knows, you can never prove me wrong. Let's dive into a parallel universe then, and speculate what would have happened if Oscar Piastri had never left Alpine. I think it's best to start with some early groundwork. If Oscar starts 2023 alongside Ocon at Team Baguette, what does that mean for the rest of the grid? The two names we have to consider here are of course the man Oscar originally replaced, the honey badger Daniel Ricciardo at McLaren, and then the man who eventually stepped into the Alpine, Frenchman Pierre Gasly. Ricciardo's stay at McLaren had not gone well. 2022 was the second of a 3-year deal that, despite chalking up a shock win at the 2021 Italian Grand Prix, had made Lewis Hamilton's current Ferrari stint look like somewhat of a success by comparison. It was clear as early as the Monaco Grand Prix that the team were exploring options to cut that contract short and bring someone in to replace Daniel for 2023, and Oscar was the perfect candidate. The first question though, is there anybody else who's worth paying Daniel Ricciardo an eye-watering amount of money to not drive for the team for another year? It would be very easy to slot Gasly into this spot. The guy's currently in his prime at AlphaTauri. The Red Bull have made it more than clear that they see no future with him at the top team, but I'm also not sure he was exciting enough to warrant paying off Ricciardo. Alternatively, the team could have looked to stick with a rookie and take an eventual 2022 Formula 2 world champion Felipe Drugovich, but it'd still end up being one of the late bloomers in that series, take the likes of Nick De Vries or Mick Schumacher as other examples, whose pace rarely translates well into Formula 1. That's why no one ever took him, and likely won't ever again. Sorry, Felipe. A Gasly-McLaren partnership is probably the most logical option here, but I'm going to play my Ricciardo fanboy card and argue that he stays for another year to round out his contract. Okay, he stays is probably the wrong choice of wording. McLaren tolerate him for another year is probably a better way to go. Gasly thus stays at AlphaTauri, and then maybe Nick De Vries ends up being the one to replace Latifi at Williams. So that's the last we'll hear from him in this video, because this butterfly effect is going to end up complicated enough already. We can start the 2023 campaign then, where Alpine are, well, actually alright. It's easy to forget that this was the season where originally Gasly and Ocon took home one podium each. Granted, it was very much their experience that played a hand in both of those performances, so I'm not going to say Piastri matches those expectations. I think Ocon, having been at the team since 2020, would still have enough experience and pace to outperform his rookie teammate over the course of the season, though Piastri would still likely be a regular top 10 finisher, and Alpine's eventual finishing position of 6th in the standings would remain, given they essentially were in no man's land that year. McLaren, meanwhile, would likely perform slightly worse, with Ricciardo still still in the fold, potentially even losing out on those 20 points that originally saw them place higher than Aston Martin in that year's Constructors' Championship. The decision to ditch Ricciardo would have been well established at this stage, and to be honest, watching Norris go on to challenge for podiums in the second half of the year would probably be enough to convince the Australian to pack his F1 bags and return to the farm come season's end. That means no final stint at RB, which might be a good or a bad thing dependent on who you ask. That means McLaren need a new driver, and it could be very boring just to place Piastri here again, just 1 year later, but could that really happen? Remember that in this timeline, Alpine actually have a functioning corporate department that isn't, shit. And as a result, they've likely signed Piastri to either a multi-year deal, or perhaps more likely, considering he's a rookie, a 1+1 arrangement where the team have control over where he goes in 2024. Ocon finishing ahead of the Australian might also take him off McLaren's radar, who have entered the year as a top team capable of challenging at the front. With Pierre Gasly likely also fed up with AlphaTauri's strut off the end of the catwalk, now could be the time to slot him into that second papaya car, with Lawson taking the reins alongside Tsunoda half a year early. And all you lot screaming at your screens when I kept Ricciardo in 23 finally happy. Look, just let a Honey Badger fan have his moment, alright? 2024 rolls around then, and while McLaren starts to take the fight to Red Bull at the front, Alpine are, pretty f***ing awful. While the squad definitely picked up the pieces in the second half of the year, removed that shock double podium when God pissed over everyone in Brazil, and you're looking at a team destined for 8th in the overall standings. Oscar would be growing in confidence by this stage, potentially starting to outshine Ocon a lot more, just without the occasional domestic that we saw with the French Civil War we actually got that season. The Brazil result could still fall their way, but 6th place is still probably the best that team could have hoped for, and it wouldn't shock me if they ended up losing out to Haas in the closing stages of the year. What's far more interesting though, is what would have happened over at McLaren. With Norris and Gasly, they now have an experienced lineup, and from about the 6th round onwards, a consistent front runner of a car to actually utilise that. Now if we briefly return to the original timeline, McLaren of course took the 2024 Constructors' Championship, while Lando Norris introduced us to his 6-pack of bottles and threw the driver's crown in the bin. Question is, does that still play out with Gasly in the team? And I guess then it comes down to which driver I think is better, the Frenchman or Oscar Piastri. It's worth remembering that Oscar was still developing throughout 2024, and the shadow of the driver that we see nowadays, ending that year 82 points down on teammate Norris. Alpine's pace at the same time has been a lot harder to judge, thanks mainly to Alpine being f***ing useless. That being said, when we take their 2024 performances, I'm still giving the edge to Oscar on this one. I'm also factoring in Gasly's history with cars that are difficult to drive. The 2024 McLaren, as we know, was one of them. And while Pierre's come a long way since his Red Bull show, we've also got to remember that he's walking into a new team in this timeline, so I'm expecting there to be some teething troubles along the way. Why is that important, you ask? Well, it's because of the glue factory. The team I said last year didn't have a chance at the Constructors' crown, and yet by Abu Dhabi, they missed out by just 14 points. That's not really a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, and so I'm going to predict, somewhat incredibly, that Oscar Piastri, staying at Alpine for 2023, sees Ferrari take the Constructors' crown 1 year later. Oh, that was a weird sentence to get out. Where do we go from here then? Well, 2025, obviously. But where is Oscar Piastri in a driver market more volatile than wants bowel movements following an Indian takeaway? Oscar's performances, whilst nowhere near the heights of what he'd actually achieve at McLaren, would still provide him with some stock at a time where he could place himself on the board, and several seats at the top teams were potentially available. And the two in particular that I'd like to focus on were those at Mercedes and Red Bull. Merck, of course, needed someone to replace #blessed over there, as he decided he fancied sniffing a Pritt stick in Maranello for the rest of his F1 career, and it comes down to whether they'd still like to take on the likes of Kimi Antonelli if a driver like Piastri was potentially on the market. Knowing Toto Wolff and his apparent love for teenagers, I can see him sticking to the original timeline on this one. That seat at Red Bull is a little bit more complicated though. With Ricciardo retiring after his stint at Woking, Liam Lawson now has a full season to be evaluated in that AlphaTauri car. Yuki Tsunoda is still alongside him, but remember Helmut Marko hates him for some reason, so we'll leave him out of this one. Thinking like Red Bull is one of the hardest jobs in motorsport because I, to the surprise of many, actually have a brain. However, the more I think about it, a Piastri deal actually makes more sense than one might think. Thus we end up in 2025, Norris and Gasly at McLaren, going up against a Verstappen-Piastri partnership at Red Bull. While Ferrari still fall at the first hurdle, they may just have won the championship, but I'm no miracle worker. All this though, just because Alpine have a corporate department that know how to do their jobs. It just makes you wonder what other scenarios we could delve into. So if you enjoyed this, albeit slightly different video, let me know down in the comments below and what you'd like to see next. While you're at it, drop it a like and get subscribed. I've got a load of stuff planned for the remainder of the 2025 season, and if you'd like to see that even sooner, then you can become a patron or channel member. They get some exclusive content too, so check out the links in the description if that interests you at all. And a big thank you to them for supporting the channel already. I'll be back soon with another video on another topic on another day, but until then, have a good one.